Juliana Redding was found brutally murdered. I can tell you in 18 years of prosecuting cases, I've never had this much DNA.
Juliana Maureen Redding was born on October 25, 1986. Her mother, Patricia, would later note with a kind of quiet wonder that it was Picasso's birthday. And from the very first day, she said, she knew she had given birth to something special, a masterpiece. Those were her words. And when you hear the details of Juliana's life, even the small ones, especially the small ones, it is not hard to understand why. She grew up in Tucson, Arizona, in a close, devout Catholic family. Her father, Greg, worked as a pharmacist. Her mother, Patricia, raised Juliana and her younger brother, Patrick, in a home built on structure, warmth, and high expectations. The kind of home where you were loved and you were also expected to become something. Juliana became something early. 9:53 p.m., Santa Monica, California, March 15, 2008. A neighbor hears screaming. Not a television, not an argument drifting through a window from somewhere down the street. Screaming. And the sound of furniture being dragged. Objects hitting the floor. The kind of noise that makes you stop what you are doing and stand completely, still because something in your body recognizes it before your mind catches up. And then silence. Inside a small bungalow on Centinela Avenue, a 21-year-old woman named Juliana Redding was fighting for her life. Bars on the windows. A front door that required a key to open from the outside. A place that looked from every angle like it was safe. Someone was already inside. And when it was over, when the screaming stopped and the silence took hold, that someone did not run. They stayed. They turned on the gas stove. They lit a large decorative candle on the coffee table. And they walked out of that apartment expecting that by morning, everything inside it, every surface, every fiber, every piece of evidence that could explain what had just happened to Juliana Redding would be ash. They were wrong. What survived in that apartment would become one of the most forensically extraordinary murder cases in Los Angeles history. A prosecutor with 18 years of experience would stand in a courtroom and say he had never seen anything like it. A detective would spend years working a single DNA profile toward a name. And a family would sit through a trial that had more physical evidence than almost any case in recent memory, and still walk out without a conviction. This is the story of Juliana Redding, who she was, how hard she fought, and what it means that the world has not yet given her justice. This is the Crime Daily series. Let's begin. Before we go anywhere near that apartment on Centinela Avenue, you need to know who Juliana Redding was. Not the victim, not the case number, not the photograph that appeared on the news, the person. As a little girl, she collected business cards. She carried them around in her great-grandfather's black leather briefcase, a Scotty's briefcase, worn at the edges, full of weight and history, and she would tell anyone who would listen that she was going to be a businesswoman one day. Picture that for a moment. A small girl with a briefcase full of other people's business cards, already mapping the version of herself she intended to grow into. Her grandmother used to take her to executive board meetings, rooms full of adults, formal and focused, the kind of environment most children would squirm through. Juliana sat quietly and fit right in. The confidence was always there, not performed, not practiced, just present. At South Point Catholic High School in Tucson, she stayed just as active. 4 years of golf, and in her senior year, the team ranked first in the state. Track and field, soccer, the recycling club, student council, drama, she was not dabbling. She was living at full volume, wanting to experience as much as possible before she stepped out into whatever came next. Her school advisor, Sister Helen Rao, said she simply had a love of life that naturally spread to everyone around her. That is a particular kind of person. The kind you notice when they walk into a room. The kind whose absence leaves a shape. In 2005, she was selected as a Tucson Symphony debutante, poised, confident, completely at ease being seen. That same year, she graduated and moved to California. She enrolled at Santa Monica College studying communications. She signed with a national modeling agency. She worked as a hostess, then as a waitress, landing modeling jobs on the side, product shoots, music videos, earning around $3,000 per job. She had her own one-bedroom apartment on Centinela Avenue, close to the beach. She was 20 years old and she was building something entirely her own. By 18, she had already earned her first film credit, a small role in an independent film. Not huge, but a beginning. And everything about Juliana Redding suggested that beginnings were just that, beginnings. She was not done. She had barely started. Before we go any further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. People following Juliana's story are spread all across this country and I want to know who's here with me. Drop it below. In early 2007, Juliana was working a shift at a restaurant in Santa Monica when she met a man named Dr. Munir Uweda. Ueda was a Lebanese-American physician who ran a large and sprawling medical business across Southern California. He was established, well-connected, and operated with a confidence that matched his resources. When he offered Juliana a job as a medical assistant, the pay was good, really good. Good enough that she could afford a Range Rover. Good enough that for a young woman building her life from scratch in one of the most expensive cities in the country, it looked like acceleration. For a time, the relationship went beyond professional. Juliana moved into his home in Beverly Hills. He gave her gifts. He treated her generously. And somewhere along the way, what had started as an employment arrangement became something more. But not everyone was comfortable with what they saw. When Juliana's father, Greg Redding, learned that Ueda was married with children, he did not hesitate. He told his daughter directly, leave. He believed the man was dangerous, not just morally complicated. Dangerous. It is worth pausing here, because warnings like that, delivered plainly, by a parent who trusts what they are seeing, often matter far more than they appear to in the moment. And this one quietly changed the direction of everything that followed. Juliana listened to her father. She ended the relationship. She moved back into her apartment in Santa Monica, returned to school, kept working. From the outside, it looked like she had made the break cleanly, like she was moving forward. But one thread had already been tied that could not be undone. She had introduced Greg Redding to Munir Ueda. What followed was a business arrangement. Ueda's medical operation worked with pharmaceutical pain creams, and Greg, a pharmacist, entered into a deal with him. For a while, everything appeared to be moving in the right direction. But Greg was watching. And the longer he watched, the less legitimate the operation appeared to him. On March 10th, 2008, 5 days before Juliana was killed, Greg Redding made a formal decision. He pulled out of the deal, in writing. Prosecutors would later argue that this decision did not sit well with Munir Ueda, that the withdrawal of a business partner, documented and final, set something in motion that ended in a bungalow on Centinela Avenue 5 days later. And this is the detail that sits at the center of everything, the detail that makes Juliana's story so particular and so painful. She had already done what her father asked. She had already walked away from Ueda. She had already put distance between herself and that world. She had gone back to her apartment, back to school, back to building the life she had always planned. She was not the business partner who pulled out of the deal. She was the daughter. And according to the prosecution's theory, that was enough. That connection, the one she had unknowingly created by introducing two men to each other, was enough to make her the most accessible point of pressure in a dispute that had nothing to do with her. The trap had closed before she ever knew it was there. Saturday, March 15, 2008. Juliana Redding spent the evening the way young women in their early 20s spend Saturday evenings in Santa Monica. She was with friends. She worked a shift. She went home. Her boyfriend at the time was a surfer named John Gilmore. They had been on and off for nearly 2 years. That evening, he called her. She told him she was fine. He mentioned going out for beers with friends. She said okay. They hung up. That was the last time anyone spoke to Juliana Redding. At 9:53 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing screaming. Not a brief sound, movement, furniture being dragged or knocked over, the unmistakable audio of a struggle happening in close quarters, and then silence. The kind of silence that arrives too quickly and settles too completely. Police believe entry to the apartment was made just before 10 p.m. The bungalow on Centinela Avenue looked, by every external measure, like a place designed for safety. Bars on the windows. A front door that required a key to open from the outside. Former prosecutor Alan Jackson would later describe it as the last place a young woman would ever think she was being watched. A quiet residential street, a secure unit, a home. But someone was already inside. What happened next was not quick. It was not clean. It was a fight, a sustained, desperate, physically devastating fight that moved through the apartment and left its record on every surface it touched. Furniture pushed out of position. Objects broken. The apartment becoming a kind of involuntary archive of everything Juliana went through in those final minutes. She did not go quietly. That matters. It needs to be said directly, and it needs to be held. Juliana Redding fought. She fought with everything she had. Her attacker slammed her head against the floor with enough force to leave deep injuries. Her throat was crushed. And in the medical and forensic record of what her body went through, investigators found one detail that is almost impossible to read without flinching. Her own DNA was found under her own fingernails. She had been clawing at her neck, trying to pull her attacker's hands away from her throat. That is an instinctive, desperate, survival response, the body's last attempt to create space, to breathe, to survive. She was still trying. In the final moments of her life, In her own home, on an ordinary Saturday night, Juliana Redding was still fighting. At some point during the attack, a 911 call was placed from her phone. It was cut off before it connected. Someone stopped it. How close she was, how close help was, is a question that does not have a clean answer. And maybe that is for the best, because the answer, in any direction, is unbearable. After she was dead, the person or people responsible did not leave. The gas stove was turned on. A large decorative candle was lit on the coffee table. The gas was left to fill the apartment slowly and visibly, with a single open flame waiting to ignite it. Whoever did this walked out of that bungalow on Centinela Avenue fully expecting that by morning, the structure would be gone. The evidence would be gone. Juliana would be gone, not just from life but from record. A fire would have consumed everything that could explain what happened to her. The building was old. Its ventilation was imperfect in exactly the right way. The gas did not build to the concentration required. The explosion never came. Juliana's mother, Patricia, spent the next day trying to reach her daughter. No answer. After days of unreturned calls and growing dread, she contacted the Santa Monica Police Department. Officers were dispatched to Centinela Avenue. When they arrived, the front door was unlocked. The moment they opened it, the smell of natural gas hit them, heavy, immediate, unmistakable. Inside, a candle still flickered on the coffee table. The entire apartment had been staged as a bomb, and it had not gone off. They found her in the back bedroom. The person who tried to erase what happened in that apartment had failed. The evidence was still there. Every surface, every fiber, every trace they had left behind in the process of taking Juliana's life, still there, still waiting. And the investigation that followed would prove to be unlike almost anything law enforcement in Los Angeles had ever seen. Detectives from the Santa Monica Police Department got to work immediately. And almost from the first walkthrough of that apartment, something was clear. There was DNA everywhere. Not a trace, not a smear that required interpretation. Not the kind of marginal forensic evidence that requires expert testimony just to establish it exists. Everywhere. On multiple surfaces, in multiple locations, in a volume and distribution that told investigators something important before they had even begun to process it fully. Prosecutor Alan Jackson, a man with 18 years of experience handling some of the most complex criminal cases in Southern California, would later stand in a courtroom and say this directly. In 18 years of prosecuting cases, he had never seen this much DNA. 18 years. Never seen anything like it. Walk through what was found and where, because each location carries meaning. DNA on the door lock. Someone touched that lock coming in or going out or both, and left a biological trace on the mechanism itself. DNA on a plate in the kitchen sink. On the knob of the gas stove, the same knob that had been turned on deliberately, intentionally, as part of the staging of the scene. The person who turned that gas on left their DNA on the device they used to do it. DNA on the front of Juliana's t-shirt. DNA on the back of Juliana's t-shirt. And then the location that carries the most weight of all. DNA on her throat. On the skin of her neck, at the site of the injuries that killed her. Whoever strangled Juliana Redding left their biological material on her body in the act of taking her life. That is not trace evidence. That is not circumstantial. That is the most direct form of forensic connection that a crime scene can produce. A biological signature left in the commission of the act itself. The phone records added another layer to the timeline. The neighbor's report of screaming at 9:53 p.m. The 911 call, placed from Juliana's phone shortly after, cut off before it could connect, and then nothing. The apartment going quiet, the gas going on, the candle lit, an exit made in the dark. The staging of the scene told investigators something beyond the immediate facts. It told them that whoever did this understood evidence. They knew that what they had left behind needed to be destroyed. The fire was not an act of panic. It was a plan, a deliberate, calculated attempt to eliminate a crime scene that the perpetrator understood was richly documented. They were right about that last part. The scene was richly documented. They were wrong about the fire. Initial investigation followed standard procedure. John Gilmore, Juliana's boyfriend, was questioned. He admitted he had come by the apartment the morning after the attack, before anyone knew she was dead, and said he had seen through the security door that a candle was still burning inside. He denied any involvement. His DNA was tested. He was cleared. Investigators then tested the DNA of 40 women who had known Juliana. 40 individual samples processed and compared. Nothing matched. The unknown profile remained unknown. So detectives followed the other thread, the one that led not toward Juliana's personal life, but toward the world her father had briefly entered. The business arrangement, the pharmaceutical pain creams. The man who had once been Juliana's employer and whose orbit Greg Redding had exited in writing 5 days before his daughter was killed. That thread led toward Munir Uweda and the people around him. The unknown DNA profile had a home somewhere in that world. Investigators were certain of it, finding it would take time, methodical work, and a detective who refused to let the case go cold. Her name was Karen Thompson, and she had been there from the very beginning. If this case is new to you, stay until the end, because what happens in that courtroom is something most people never fully hear about. Hit the like button right now if you're still with me. It costs you nothing, and it helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. In the world around Dr. Munir Uweda, there were many people who served many functions: real estate brokers, personal assistants, financial managers, the kind of support network that a large and complex medical business operation tends to accumulate. People whose roles overlapped, whose responsibilities shifted, whose titles did not always fully describe what they actually did. And then there was Kelly Sue Park. In court documents, Park was described as Uweda's real estate broker, his personal assistant, his financial manager. But there was another description, one that reportedly came from Uweda himself. He called her his James Bond. That phrase, offered apparently without irony, tells you something about how he understood her role. Not administrative, not professional in the conventional sense. Something else, something that operated in the space between a business dispute and a physical response to it. Prosecutors built a theory of Park's function within Uweda's operation that went well beyond managing properties and processing payments. They argued that when people crossed Uweda, particularly in financial disputes, particularly when someone attempted to exit an arrangement he did not want them to exit, Park was the person who dealt with it. Intimidation, threats, physical confrontation when the situation called for it. And court filings suggested this was not new behavior. Investigators found a pattern, alleged incidents involving other people, often women, where Park had allegedly been used to apply pressure and fear in service of Uweda's interests, which raises the question that sits at the very center of this case. Was Juliana Redding ever the actual target, or was she the message? The prosecution's theory of March 15, 2008 goes like this. Greg Redding had pulled out of the business deal 5 days earlier. Formally in writing, with finality, and according to prosecutors, that was not acceptable. Park was sent to Centinela Avenue that evening, not, they argued, to kill Juliana, but to confront her, to use her as leverage, to send a message back through her to the father who had walked away. But Juliana Redding fought back, and in that fight, prosecutors argued, everything escalated past the point of no return. She was strangled, and the woman sent to deliver a message became the center of a murder investigation. The financial records introduced at trial added a layer to this theory that was difficult to dismiss on its face alone. 3 weeks before Juliana's death, Kelly Sue Park had been paid $250,000. In the 18 months following the murder, more than $1 million was transferred to Park from Uweda's accounts. $1 million over 18 months. From the man whose dispute with Greg Redding preceded his daughter's death by 5 days. Prosecutors did not argue these numbers were proof on their own, but they presented them as part of a pattern, a financial relationship between Uweda and Park that did not look like real estate brokerage fees, that did not look like personal assistant compensation, that looked, when placed alongside the timeline of Juliana's death and the DNA recovered from her apartment, like something else entirely. Park was not arrested until March 17, 2010. 2 years after Juliana died, bail was set at $3.5 million. Someone paid it. Prosecutors believed that someone was Uweda. Shortly after Park's arrest, Uweda left the country. By the time the trial began, he had not come back, and so the case moved forward with the DNA, the financial records, the prosecution's theory of that night. But without the man prosecutors believed had set everything in motion ever sitting in that courtroom. Part of the story was missing before the trial even started. Detective Karen Thompson had been present from the beginning. She was there when the apartment on Centinela Avenue was first processed. She was there through the early interviews, the initial testing, the elimination of John Gilmore, the testing of 40 women, the dead ends and the redirections. And when the case did not break quickly, when months passed and then years and the unknown DNA profile remained unknown, she stayed with it. That kind of sustained attention is not dramatic in the way television makes it look. It is methodical, patient. The work of someone who has decided that a case is not finished just because it is not moving fast. The break came from a direction the investigation had been building toward for a long time. Investigators began testing people connected to Uweda's network, one by one, systematically working outward from a center that had always been present in the case, always adjacent to the timeline, always connected to the business dispute that preceded Juliana's death. Each new sample compared against the unknown DNA profile recovered from that apartment, and then the profile fit. Kelly Sue Park. The match was not marginal. It was not a partial hit that required interpretation or probabilistic language to explain. The unknown DNA found across the interior of Juliana Redding's apartment matched Kelly Sue Park. Go back through the locations with that name now attached. The door lock, Park's DNA. She had touched that lock. Coming in, going out, or both. The plate in the kitchen sink, Park's DNA. She had been in that kitchen. The gas stove knob, the same knob turned deliberately to flood the apartment with gas. The staging mechanism intended to destroy every piece of evidence in the scene. Park's DNA. Her hand had turned that knob. Juliana's cell phone, Park's DNA. And then the location that no forensic explanation can make anything other than what it is. Juliana's throat. Park's DNA. On the skin of her neck. At the site of the injuries that killed her. The biological record of that night pointed, in every location that mattered, toward the same person. Detective Thompson had found the name. Park was arrested on March 17, 2010, 2 years and 2 days after Juliana Redding died in her apartment on Centinela Avenue. Bail was set at $3.5 million. Someone paid it. And Munir Uweda, already out of the country, did not return. The case that had been built, carefully, methodically, across 2 years of sustained investigative work, was now headed to trial. The DNA was extraordinary. The financial records were compelling. The prosecution had assembled what Alan Jackson believed was the most forensically documented case of his career. It should have been the end of the story. The long, painful, overdue end. It was not. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. You've just heard what was found. DNA on the door, on the phone, on a plate in the kitchen, and on her throat. What do you think the verdict was? Leave it in the comments before we get there. I read every single one. And while you're down there, what time is it where you are right now? Drop it below. This case deserves attention at every hour. The trial of Kelly Sue Park opened in mid-May of 2013. 5 years after Juliana Redding died. 5 years of her family waiting for a courtroom, waiting for a jury, waiting for the moment when all of the evidence assembled across all of those years would finally be placed in front of 12 people who would decide what it meant. The case drew attention, locally and nationally. It had the elements that pull an audience, a young victim, a Los Angeles setting, a female defendant, a physician who had fled the country and was conspicuously absent from the proceedings he had allegedly set in motion. And then there was the evidence, the volume of it, the specificity of it. Prosecutor Alan Jackson presented the theory clearly and directly. Park had been sent to Juliana's apartment on the evening of March 15, 2008. Not to kill her, at least not as the original purpose. To confront her, to use her as a pressure point, a way of sending a message back to her father, the man who had formally withdrawn from Uweda's business 5 days earlier. But Juliana had fought back, and in that fight the confrontation became a murder. Park had strangled her with her bare hands. Afterward, she had staged the scene, turned on the gas, lit the candle, and left the apartment expecting fire to finish what she had started. The financial records were introduced. The $250,000 paid to Park 3 weeks before the murder. The more than $1 million transferred in the 18 months that followed. The pattern of payments that, alongside the DNA evidence, formed the prosecution's picture of what Park's role in Uweda's operation actually looked like. But there was something the jury was not allowed to hear. Prosecutors were legally prevented from telling the full story they believed in. They could not argue that Uweda had ordered the killing. They could not present the broader picture of his alleged operations, the pattern of alleged intimidation, the other alleged victims, the architecture of what they believed he had built, and how Park functioned within it. The jury saw the forensic case, detailed, technically rigorous, heavy with physical evidence, but the frame around it, the why, the full context of who sent Park and why Juliana was chosen, was legally off the table. The defense, led by attorney George Buhler, kept its argument focused on a single principle, reasonable doubt. Yes, the DNA was present in the apartment. Yes, Park's fingerprints were found. But Buhler told the jury that presence was not proof of murder. He raised a physical question that he returned to throughout the trial. Park stood at 5 feet 10 inches and approximately 150 pounds. Could she alone have overpowered and strangled Juliana Redding? He challenged the handling of the evidence. He challenged the timeline. He challenged the motive as the prosecution had been permitted to present it, stripped of the context that would have given it full weight. Expert witnesses testified on both sides. The DNA findings were explained, the collection process detailed, the match confirmed, the injuries were described, the strangulation, the head trauma, what each wound indicated about the nature and duration of the attack. The prosecution's case was technically thorough, and on June 4, 2013, the jury of 6 men and 6 women returned their verdict: not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom did not absorb that quietly. Park broke down in tears. From the gallery, voices rose. People called out. Some were crying. One voice cut clearly through the noise. She knows she did it. The emotion in that room was not controlled or polite. It was the sound of people who had followed the evidence and could not reconcile what they had heard with the 2 words the jury had just spoken. Juliana's family walked out of that courtroom without a conviction, without clear answers, without the outcome that 18 years of prosecutorial experience and an extraordinary volume of physical evidence had led everyone connected to this case to believe was coming. Later reports indicated that even some defense experts were surprised by the verdict. And the question that has lived in this case ever since, quiet, heavy, without a clean answer, is the same one prosecutor Alan Jackson implied when he described the evidence he had assembled. If this was not enough, then what would have been? The verdict on June 4, 2013 was not the end. It was a different kind of ending, the kind that closes a door permanently, not by resolution, but by law. Double jeopardy. Kelly Sue Park had been tried for Juliana Redding's murder. She had been found not guilty. No new evidence, no future development, no revelation that might emerge in the years ahead could bring her back to trial for the same crime. That door closed the moment the jury spoke, and it has not opened since. The world around Munir Uweda continued to unravel in ways that did not touch what had happened to Juliana. In 2015, reports surfaced that Uweda had been arrested in Germany. His exact legal situation remained unclear, the details uncertain, the outcome publicly unresolved in the way that details about people who have left the country and retained resources tend to remain unresolved. Around the same time, Kelly Sue Park was arrested again. Not for murder, that avenue was permanently closed, but on fraud charges connected to a massive medical insurance scheme allegedly tied to Uweda, Southern California practice. The numbers were staggering, approximately $150 million, 15 people indicted. Park's bail in that case was set at $18.5 million. The medical empire Uweda had built collapsed through its own weight. In 2010, the Medical Board of California placed him on probation for allowing a physician's assistant to perform surgeries without supervision. By 2013, his medical license was canceled. Whatever he had constructed across Southern California, the practices, the financial arrangements, the network of people operating inside around his business, did not survive. None of it brought Juliana back. None of it changed what had been decided in that courtroom in 2013. Juliana Redding was laid to rest on March 28, 2008 at St. Odelia's Church in Tucson, Arizona, the city where she was born, the city where she grew up, where she carried a briefcase full of business cards and told anyone who would listen that she was going to be something. She was buried at home, surrounded by the people who had loved her entire life. The Santa Monica Police Department has never closed the case. They continue to ask anyone with information to come forward. The file still exists. The evidence is still cataloged. And somewhere in a forensic database, a DNA profile sits attached to Juliana Redding's name. A biological record of exactly what happened in that apartment on Centinela Avenue on March 15, 2008. The science worked. The identification was made. The evidence was presented to a jury. And the person whose DNA was on her throat walked out of that courtroom free. The gap between what the evidence showed and what the jury decided is the space this case still occupies, 17 years later. It has no clean edges. It does not resolve. It simply remains. In forensic and legal circles, the Juliana Redding case is taught and discussed as something specific, not as a cold case, not as an unsolved mystery. As an example of the gap, the particular painful, structurally important gap between what evidence can establish scientifically and what a jury can be persuaded of beyond reasonable doubt. The DNA science worked. It did exactly what forensic science is designed to do. It identified an unknown profile. It matched it to a person. It placed that person at the scene, in the kitchen, at the door, on the phone, and on the neck of the woman who was killed. The technology performed, the methodology held. The chain of custody was maintained. And it was not enough. Not because the science failed, but because the jury, prevented by law from hearing the full context of why Juliana was targeted, operating without the broader picture that the prosecution believed was essential to understanding the evidence in front of them, found reasonable doubt in the space between what the DNA proved and what it could not alone fully explain. That gap is real. It exists in the architecture of the legal system by design, because the burden of proof in a criminal trial is supposed to be nearly impossible to meet. The protection that creates wrongful acquittals is the same protection that prevents wrongful convictions. The system carries both possibilities simultaneously, knowing that does not make it easier to sit with. Because at the center of this case, behind the forensics, behind the trial strategy, behind the legal arguments about reasonable doubt and prosecutorial limitations is a person, Juliana Redding, who collected business cards in her great-grandfather's leather briefcase because she already knew she was going to be something, who played golf and ran track and joined student council and stood on a debutante stage in Tucson, and then drove herself to California at 18 and got an apartment near the beach and started building the life she had always planned. Who, on the last night of her life, fought with everything she had. The DNA under her own fingernails says so, the clawing at her own throat, the desperate survival response of a young woman who was not ready, who had so much ahead of her, who did not go quietly. That is part of the forensic record of this case, and it should be part of how we remember her. She was not a footnote. She was not a cautionary detail in a story about someone else's crimes. She was Juliana Redding, and she deserved every year she did not get. The case is still open. Somebody knows something, and she is still worth finding justice for. Let's come back to where we started. A quiet residential street in Santa Monica, a bungalow with bars on the windows and a door that required a key, a place that looked, by every measure, like it was safe. A 21-year-old woman who had spent her Saturday working and laughing with friends and talking to her boyfriend on the phone before she said goodnight. And then 9:53 p.m. screaming, movement, silence. Someone tried to burn that apartment to the ground to make sure the world would never know what happened inside it. The building's old ventilation saved the evidence. Detective Karen Thompson's years of patient, methodical work gave it a name. A prosecutor with 18 years of experience stood in a courtroom and called it the most DNA he had ever seen in a murder case. And still, no conviction. Juliana Redding's case is still open. The Santa Monica Police Department continues to ask anyone with information to come forward. If you know anything at all, about what happened on Sentinel Avenue on March 15, 2008, or about anyone connected to the events of that night, contact the Santa Monica Police Department directly. Every detail matters. Every piece of information that has not yet been shared with investigators is a piece that might finally close the gap. This channel does not move on because the headlines have. We stay with the stories that deserve more than a single news cycle. We stay with the people at the center of them. Juliana Redding deserves more than a verdict that didn't come. She deserves to be remembered fully, not as a victim, but as the person she was and the person she was becoming. We will keep telling her story until it ends the way it should. If you watch this entire video, you are exactly who this channel was built for. Hit subscribe and turn on your notifications because more stories like this are coming and you do not want to miss them. And leave a comment below. What do you think justice looks like for Juliana Redding? The conversation in this comment section matters. Let's have it. She fought back. That is how she should be remembered.